Sri Lanka is a small island country off the coast of India and is home to over 23 million residents. However, the population distribution of these inhabitants could not be more varying. On one side, we have the Sinhalese, the majority that rules the country through government and makes up around 80% of the population. And then, on the other side, we have the Tamils, the minority of around 10% of the population has been fighting for the right of a separate state. But the true question is, how did we get here?
British East India Company conquered Sri Lanka, referred to by the British as Ceylon, during the French Revolutionary Wars from 1792 to 1801. Following the Netherlands' occupation by the French, the British commenced their push into Sri Lanka from India. The Dutch surrendered in 1796 after a lackluster resistance. The British initially perceived their conquest as temporary and administered the island from Madras, modern-day Chennai. The conflict with France highlighted Sri Lanka's strategic importance, prompting the British to solidify their control over the island. In 1802, Ceylon was designated as a crown colony, and British ownership of maritime Ceylon was ratified through the Treaty of Amiens with France. The island was partitioned into 3 administrative regions named after their main cities, Colombo, Galle, and Jaffna. Colombo was governed by the governor, while commanders ruled over Galle and Jaffna. The area devoted to coffee farming increased, and roads were built to meet the demands of coffee growers. Due to a labor shortage on the plantations, a large number of indentured workers from southern India began arriving in the 1840s.
We start to see the Sinhalese and the Tamils start to quarrel later, as the Tamils originally had more people, especially in the other British colonies like India and other places in the east.
Experiments with tea as a plantation crop in the 1880s quickly proved to be successful, and tea cultivation spread across the upper and lower slopes of the hill country. Meanwhile, the majority of the country continued in subsistence agriculture, relying on conventional methods.
The British continue with these agricultural methods for the next couple decades, and then we start to see the war period start, and Ceylon starts becoming more and more autonomous. The British people start appointing more and more leaders from Ceylon, not from Britain. And as we'll begin to see, Ceylon eventually is going to start becoming independent from the motherland.
Later, as World War II started, the British started to set Ceylon as a more independent nation. Ceylon finally became independent with the 1947 Ceylon Independence Act. This is where Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, begins to head down a dark path. Another relevant policy was standardization, which sought to enhance educational prospects for underprivileged Sinhalese students. This policy mandated that Tamil students attain higher exam scores than their Sinhalese peers to gain admission to Sri Lankan universities. Legislators devised a scheme that mirrored affirmative action for the Sinhalese who faced disadvantages during the British colonialism. Under British colonial governance, the tensions between the Sinhalese and Tamils intensified. Since Tamil communities were present in various other British colonies, such as India, South Africa, and Singapore, Sri Lankan Tamils were able to take advantage of extensive commercial networks and a broader spectrum of opportunities. Following independence, numerous Sinhalese ascended to high positions within the government. These Sinhalese acquired power and progressively enacted laws that effectively disenfranchised their Tamil counterparts. One notable example is the infamous Sinhala Only Act. Former Sri Lankan President Chandrika Bandaranaike interprets this act, which her father supported, as an effort to foster and reclaim a Sri Lankan identity lost during the lengthy period of British rule. As tensions continued to rise, the Tamils became more and more fed up and started proposing solutions to the discrimination against them. One proposed solution was the idea of a separate state for the Tamils called Tamil Eelam. While this idea might seem far-fetched, the populations already lived in separate spheres of the country. The Tamils predominantly occupied the northern and eastern areas of the country, and the Sinhalese in the southern, western, and central regions. With this information in mind, the idea made perfect sense. The country had already declared its favoritism for Sinhalese people with the Sinhala Only Act and Standardization Acts. In addition to this, the Tamils could have their own country to practice their beliefs and live in peace without discrimination. However, the idea was met with mixed reactions from the Tamils themselves. While the majority supported it, there were still some that were opposed to Elam. But with this in mind, several Tamil groups began fighting for the right to become sole representatives of the Tamils. Ultimately, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, LTTE, led by Velupilli Prabhakaran, beat out the other prominent Tamil groups, including Tamil Elam Liberation Organization, TELO, to be the main representative of the Tamil population. From this point, a long brewing discourse eventually erupted into war. The century-long disagreements and discourse between Tamils and Sinhalese eventually boiled over into a large-scale conflict. During July of 1983, the Tamils ambushed a Sinhalese army convoy in Colombo, killing soldiers and seizing materials. This action triggered large riots all throughout the city of Colombo, killing several thousand Tamils. It is estimated around 2,500 Tamils were killed during that fateful month, which was later deemed Black July. From this point, Tamils and Sinhalese people began to engage in riots and small-scale battles throughout Tamil-occupied areas in Sri Lanka. In 1987, India deployed a peacekeeping force that only stayed for 3 years due to how high the tensions were. Later in 2002, Norway helped organize a ceasefire which temporarily eased tensions for a couple years. However, the flame that was the hatred the two ethnic groups had for each other was reignited in 2005 when the Minister of Sri Lankan Foreign Affairs, Lakshman Katargamar, was assassinated. This led to the government and the rebels breaking the ceasefire several times before it was eventually abolished in 2008. This conflict was claimed to be ended in 2009 when the Sri Lankan government killed the LTTE leader and effectively ended the large-scale war. While tensions seem to have settled in Sri Lanka up front, there are still several underlying problems, riots, and even acts of war crime in the country today from both sides. Beginning with the Tamils putting civilians at the front line of large-scale riots and battles, fully expecting civilian casualties in order to generate hatred against the government. The Tamils also participated in the kidnapping of Sinhalese children during the latter stage of the war. There have also been several cases of surrender that were not met with appropriate reaction by the Sinhalese government. These reactions included rape, false killings, and abduction, and this does not include the several alleged war crimes committed by leaders of both sides of the conflict. The connection of rights and responsibilities to the topic is when the century-long large-scale conflict began. The Tamils had dominance over the Sinhalese during the British occupation in the early 1900s. Being the majority, the Tamils had a responsibility to maintain the balance of rights and privileges between themselves and the Sinhalese. This was not able to be achieved because of the several catering acts that the British gave to the Tamils, making their lives easier. Several of these stemming from favoritism rooted from other Tamil groups prospering in other British-owned territory, most notably in India. With this responsibility not upheld by the Tamils, the Sinhalese took into their own hands to balance out the rights and give themselves what they believed to be rightfully theirs. The most notable act of them all being the 1956 Sinhala Only Act. This act is a direct example of how power can be abused and can create large-scale conflicts. It gave large preferences to the Sinhalese as it made Sinhala the national language and created large issues for the Tamils trying to get jobs or public employment. This, paired along with the standardization to boost the Sinhalese over the Tamils, was a poor use of power and was an example of how to use responsibility incorrectly. These acts led to a war that lasted over 3 decades, the formation of a semi-international terrorist group, and the disorganization and unraveling of a country from the inside. Now, tensions have seemed to die down, but there are still individual acts of terrorism within the country that include kidnapping, torture, bombings, and shootings. Overall, the rights and responsibilities that both groups had at separate times were not used correctly and therefore created a large imbalance in the privileges of two ethnic groups. This imbalance led to war, terrorism, crimes, and other horrible acts. In the future, developing civilizations and countries can look at Sri Lanka as an example of how not to healthily solve an imbalance and develop a country.